Hello, we are back and ready to go in the scripture today. This last week we needed to read 2 Kings 20 to 1 Chronicles 14, and it was a little different as we jump into Chronicles. Chronicles kind of reminds us a little bit of what it was like back in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. And so as you were going through that, you could have gotten bogged down with all of the names. Maybe you would just kind of ran through all of that, and that's okay. They are important. The names, the lineages create a lot of credibility of Scripture, and that's why they're important. But we're going to go into 2 Kings chapter 20, and when you come to 2 Kings 20, we're really talking about one of the more famous kings in Judah, King Hezekiah, who was a good king. He was if you remember, he was the first king that tore down all the high places. We will, in this reading, discover that he wasn't the greatest of the kings. I think, Alex, if I were to ask people who was the greatest king in Judah, most people would say probably King David. Wouldn't you agree? Most people would agree that King David was the greatest. Mm-hmm. And then they might go to Hezekiah. And I would say after reading the readings this time, both of those answers are wrong.
I know. I was surprised by that in the reading this week.
It's pretty interesting. So we'll start with Hezekiah. Hezekiah gets sick. He becomes ill to the point of death. There really is there's no word in there what it was that was causing him to be that way, if he was an injury sustained in war or battle. But the prophet Isaiah comes to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah really, like most of the kings, would go to the prophets and ask, will I recover? They didn't want to wait to find out what would happen. They just wanted to know, will I recover? And the current prophet is Isaiah, the same prophet of Isaiah that we have the book of Isaiah, and we'll be reading that a little bit here in a few weeks. But Isaiah goes to Hezekiah and says, basically, you're going to die. You should put your house in order because this is the end. And what's interesting is Hezekiah doesn't just accept that. He turns his face to the wall and prays to the Lord, and he causes the Lord to remember all of the things that he's done for the Lord. And it says that he wept bitterly. And even though Isaiah had left, the Lord comes to Isaiah and says to Isaiah, you need to go back because I've heard the cries of Hezekiah, and he's going to live for 15 more years, and God gives him 15 more years. We see that in verses 3 and 5 of chapter 20. See, what we're seeing here, and something that I thought was interesting in this verse, is many people don't believe that they can change the mind of God, and that God is perfect in every way. And so he makes up his mind, and they don't see that they can change the mind of God. But the reality is they can through prayer. And it doesn't mean God's mind will always be changed, and it doesn't mean that God isn't in control and he's not perfect. It's not that God isn't perfect. God had said that he would die, but because Hezekiah humbled himself and went to the Lord, God gave him 15 more years.
It's like Ahab.
Yes.
Even as someone as wicked as Ahab,
he had mercy on, and he changed. See, this is the thing, the power of prayer. I think a lot of times we don't believe God's just going to do what he wants to do. If it's God's will, it was God's plan that Hezekiah was going to die. But God changed his plan. God relented when man prayed. The importance of prayer and the importance of doing that on a regular basis in our life. And what's interesting to me is Isaiah goes back and tells him, hey, the Lord heard your prayer. You're going to live another 15 years. And I thought this was incredibly interesting. Hezekiah goes, well, what would the sign be that I'll be healed? Rather than waiting and just trusting that this prophet who said he was going to die, and he believed the prophet when he said he's going to die, isn't it amazing how we tend to believe the negative than we do the positive. And Isaiah says, you're going to die. And he didn't ask for a sign of that. But when he comes back and says, wait, the Lord just spoke to him, you're going to live. Isaiah goes, well, I need a sign. Well, the sign will approach you when you're healed, Isaiah. Like what difference did it make if he got a sign? Yeah. But God gives him a sign. Of course, it's with the shadow going back and forth. And you see that in the steps. And so God gives him 15 more years, and you would think Hezekiah, after being, he was a wise king, he was a good king, you'd think he'd be wise, but he does something that's incredibly unwise. And when the envoy from Babylon, or the leaders of Babylon, come to see Hezekiah, he wants to show off.
Oh, buddy.
And so he takes them through everything in his palace and in the kingdom, essentially to impress the people of Babylon. And why that's so crazy is in that day, they didn't come to see what you were doing. They wanted to see if it was worth coming to conquer you. Should they send the soldiers? Is it of value? What will we get when we come to overcome you? And Isaiah comes to him and says, hey, Hezekiah, why were they here? Why did they come? And he said, just to see what we are, to see how successful I am, to celebrate with me.
Not very street smart.
Yeah, not at all. And Isaiah says, that's not why they were here. They came because they're going to take all of this from you. And of course, we know later in the scriptures, that's exactly what happens. So that comes to the end. Hezekiah, who did all of these great things, may not have been a great father to his sons, the one that would take over Judah, because Manasseh becomes king at 12 years old and then reigns for 55 years, and he was an evil king. So you have Hezekiah, who did things for God that none of the other kings had done before. He tore down all the high places. He was even during David's time, there were high places. But Hezekiah tore those things down. He got rid of the serpent that people were worshiping that was from the wilderness. He did great things. Some would argue he was one of the greatest kings in Israel, as I had said before. But here's the interesting thing. He was followed by one of the most evil. In fact, most would agree, the Ahab of Judah. He would have been the worst king in Judah, and he did evil, and he rebuilt the evil symbols. He rebuilt high places to the point that and Solomon had done this in Hinnom, which was the valley where Molech was worshipped. He sacrificed even his own son on the altar to Molech.
Wait, say that again. Say that again. I just wanted to hear you say it again because that's pretty crazy.
Well, Manasseh and Solomon had done the same thing, but Manasseh sacrificed his own son on the altar to Molech, which was just in the valley where Jesus would refer to this place as Hinnom or Gehenna, hell is another way of saying it. And the prophets are declaring that that at that point in time, when the people turned from God, that they would be thrown into captivity because of how bad that was.
Wasn't there, who was the king that when he came to the city, I'm getting it all jumbled, but he came to the city, he was the pagan king, and because of his defeat, he sacrificed his son at the wall. Do you remember that story? We just read it the past few weeks. Are you remembering? I'm trying to recall it, but when I had read that, it reminded me of they're looking like these pagan kings, which has obviously been our whole reading,
right. Yeah, I remember it. But it's true. Because of it, when you sacrifice your children, and some would argue that this is essentially what abortion is sacrificing your children. In fact, I would argue that when we sacrifice an abortion, it is sacrificing your children. And the prophets are declaring at that point, you're no longer going to be in this land because you are now, Manasseh took it to a point that the people of Israel and Judah were acting like the Canaanites that God had expelled when they came into the land. that God, remember, we've talked about this. It isn't the Jewish land. It isn't Israel's land. It isn't the Canaanites' land. It's not the Palestinians' land. It's God's land. And he gets to choose who lives there, not the kingdoms of the world. And God says, I have brought you into this land, and now I'm going to vomit you out, essentially, as I did the Canaanites, because you've become like them. And then when Manasseh died, and Manasseh had done, it says really, Manasseh was the most evil king in Israel. So you have, and Hezekiah is someone who is this great king, and then Manasseh becomes king, and he is evil. And then his son, when Manasseh dies, his son Amnon, who becomes king at 22 years old and reigns 2 years, and he's assassinated. And that's likely because he did not have the ability to lead as a king, and they just got rid of him. And I think this is what's interesting in this. Amnon is assassinated, and his son Josiah, at 8 years old, reigns as king. Reigned 31 years, and this is what I think is interesting. In chapter 22, you see his reign. Essentially, what it says is Josiah is probably raised from in the realm of the temple. Probably some priests got a hold of him and begin to raise him in the understanding of God. He gets there. He's like, listen, let's rebuild the temple. Things have been horrible, and we have not been obedient to our roots. He sends the priest in to start fixing things, the deferred maintenance in the temple, and they discover the book of the law.
This is trippy.
And what's interesting, first of all, is they go into the temple, and they don't even know that it's there. Like, it's in a back room. It's like where some believe after the Indiana Jones movies, like the Ark of the Covenant's in a warehouse somewhere in Louisville, Kentucky. You know, it's hidden somewhere, nobody wear it in, and then eventually it's going to come out and people are going to find it. They find this book of the law that's probably got dust on it. It's been put away, hidden. God's maybe even protected it. And they're not even aware that the book exists in many cases, because
so crazy.
And how it's written, they weren't aware of it, because as they're going through and cleaning out the rooms and the places of the temple, rebuilding this, they find this book, and the priest reads through it, and he's like, oh man, this is crazy. We are in big trouble. And they bring it to Josiah, and Josiah has a moment of incredible repentance. And in verse 19 through 20, it says, the God of Israel says concerning the words you've heard, because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I have spoken against this place and its people, that they would become accursed and laid waste, because you tore your robes, wept in my presence. I have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore, I will gather you to your fathers, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I'm going to bring on this place. God had already determined, because of Manasseh, that they were going to go into exile. But because of Josiah, who brought the people of this generation back to God, and it says that Josiah really did more than David and his grandfather Hezekiah, great-grandfather Hezekiah, that it could be argued that Josiah was actually the most righteous king, not the most famous king, and not the most even talked about king. I think Hezekiah even gets some more, talked about more than that. But Josiah would have been the most righteous king. He would have been the greatest example of what God would have wanted in a king. Mm-hmm. And because he repented and because he went to the extremes, he tore down the high places. He did everything his father had done. He had a heart after God. He pursued with zeal God and
what I thought was interesting with Josiah, do you think that what was because the argument people make that ignorance, it's an ignorance claim that people that are ignorant, they remain, they're not going to be judged. This I think that kind of like spits in the face of that idea that how could you judge people that are ignorant to it? these kings were ignorant to it, but God is still going to judge them. And when he had uncovered the law and understood that they had broken the law, he then humbles himself, and then the judgment's still coming, but he's not going to see destruction because of his realization and humbled himself. Do you think this at all speaks to the God?
I think it involves, yeah, absolutely. And I think you can look at it, you can say the kings before that were good kings were getting rid of the evil altars. The high, it wasn't Hezekiah was the only one with high places, but they were bringing worship back to the temple of Israel. The question is, where was the book of law during their reigns? We don't see a mention of the book of law during their reigns. This is really kind of the first part where we realize it was like nobody knew about it.
No one said
that it was missing. At what point did the book of law become missing? So what Josiah did, which is what Hezekiah did not do, at least from what we can see. And of course, Isaiah is there. So Isaiah is bringing the word of the Lord to them as well. But the book of the law, Hezekiah was getting rid of all of the evil things, but was he instituting the God things? It's one thing to put away all the things that are creating evil and causing people to worship evil things, but are we bringing the words of life to people? Josiah, he wants to rebuild the temple. He's pursuing God. He's coming back to God. He's getting rid of all of the evil things his grandfather Manasseh had done. He's getting rid of all the priests, all of those things. But then he discovers the words of life. He discovers the book of the law, and he begins to, what's going on? And he returns to God. Well, it would be the Torah.
Okay.
So the first 5 books of the Bible is
that's what
the law referring to, which we went through. Now, this is interesting. And in chapter 23, we see it, and I don't know if you see it or not. But remember, Josiah is the king of Judah, and at this time, the kings of Israel. Israel has been taken out of the land of Israel, and they're now taken into Assyria. Remember, they were exiled to Assyria, and there are no kings in Israel. Babylonians are in Israel at this time. Remember, they took the Israelites out, and they put Babylonians in the city. Remember, we had read about how the lions were killing them, and they brought in priests back so that they could worship God because the lions were killing the people. They didn't know the gods of the land or the God of the land. Now, this is interesting because Josiah is the king of Judah. And Josiah, it says, went up to Bethel and destroyed the temple in Bethel. See, Josiah was not content to stay in Judah and cleanse the nation because they were one nation. Josiah said, really, I'm not the king of just Judah. This is all God's land, and there are temples that Jeroboam had built that need to be destroyed. Now, if you don't think God has a problem, after the people leave the land, those altars that Jeroboam built and said, come worship God here, that are supposedly holding his names, those altars are still there, even though Jeroboam's long gone and the king of Israel is gone and Israel is gone. God puts it in Josiah's heart to go clear the temples that are up there, and it was a king from Judah that tore down the altars of Jeroboam. The sin of Jeroboam. Remember, they continued in the sins of Jeroboam. What was the sins of Jeroboam? The priests that served in the temples where God said he had not put his name. And it was deceiving people to think they did not need to go to the temple in Jerusalem. They could go to the temples in Bethel and Dan and worship God that did not hold his name with priests who did not carry the responsibility that God gave them. They were assigned by man to do it, and God wanted it wiped out. And what's interesting is this land is controlled by Syria, but Josiah goes up and he begins to cleanse the land of Israel. And I believe that's God's plan, to use a king, a godly king, to go and do what the kings of Israel were not willing to do.
There's something really, like when I read this, I stopped in my tracks. I almost passed it over. In verse chapter 23, 21. Check this out. It says, And the king commanded all the people, keep the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in the book of the covenant. For no such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel or the kings of Judah. So David didn't even. Is that true?
Right, yeah.
David wouldn't have even done the Passover.
No, David would have done the Passover. I think what they were saying is when they did this Passover, David was doing the Passover. When they did this Passover, because the feasts were happening during all of those kings, they were doing the feasts. It's like doing them without an understanding what they are. I think more what it was saying, and when I read that, and in fact I had written it down here, is he had done the Passover with it was the greatest Passover they had ever done. Essentially, they made the biggest deal about this Passover than it had ever been before. What chapter or what verse is that in 23?
I guess, yeah, it says, for no such Passover. Not that there wasn't any Passover.
Yeah, that they had, Israel and the kings of Judah had any such Passover been observed like that.
So you think they might have been? Yeah. It says, as their book of the covenant. Like he's looking back to the law that he just discovered.
Yeah.
Like, do it like this.
And when you read the book of the law, the Passover, the festivals or the feasts, and there's 7 feasts 3 times of the year. And the Passover, they realize is to be celebrated. It's a big deal, and he brings it back because maybe it wasn't celebrated as much. Maybe it wasn't, especially during Manasseh's time. Maybe it wasn't celebrated as God wanted it to be celebrated, and so they celebrated Passover, but not like what Passover was supposed to be. Also, something else that's interesting in that same chapter 17, it said he's going through and he's destroying these tombs. And, in 15, the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even that altar and high place he demolished. And we've stood actually at the one in Dan that was destroyed. But at 17, if you remember, there was a man of God right after Jeroboam had built the altar. A man of God comes, doesn't tell us his name, and curses the altar. He basically says, this is not God's altar. This is not God's temple. Jeroboam doesn't like it. He reaches his finger to tell the guards to take him. Yeah. It shrivels up. He puts it in his coat, and he begs the man to heal him, and he puts the hand out, and God heals him.
This is the man of God that they're talking about?
The man of God.
Yep.
And that man of God, Jeroboam says, come on in, let's have dinner. And he says, no, I was supposed to come and go. And so he goes. Mm-hmm. Even after Jeroboam persisted, he goes. But then a prophet remember, he lies and says an angel came to him to come, and the man listens to a prophet who said he heard from an angel rather than the voice of God that's told him to go. And we talked about how God's word trumps everything, even that of an angel. And he goes and eats, and the man knows in that moment when he's eating, as soon as he finishes, that he's going to be killed. So he puts him on a donkey and says, go quickly. Well, on his way, a lion mauls him and kills him. And the donkey and the lion are standing there, didn't eat the man when the prophet comes. And the lion leaves the donkey, and they take him and they bury him in a tomb and put a tombstone on it. This is the man of God that they're talking about. And when Josiah sees it, he says, don't let anyone disturb the bones. So they spared his bones. Now, which is interesting, that's Jeroboam. We're talking hundreds of years earlier. The story of this man is relayed to Josiah. Through what? Remember, we're talking Jeroboam's the first king of Israel, and now Israel doesn't exist. And the altars, so
generations.
How
many years is that?
400 or 500 years
and they had
between the two.
Writing.
And yet you lose the book of the law, but you remember this story. It's an interesting thing. And when you think about it, even in these temples in Bethel and in Dan, where was the book of law? It's not like the book of law was there. And where was the book of law during the times of Elijah and Elisha? How was that perceived during that time because God would talk to them from his word. And in verse 25, if you go to verse 25, we told you he's probably one of the great kings. It says in verse 20, neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his strength, in accordance with all the law of Moses.
And it's the promise that David tells Solomon and supposed to tell his generations, if you do all these things, you will be blessed.
Right. But just that mindset, if you were to ask anyone who is the greatest king in Israel, in Judah, you would have to almost say, you could argue David was the king of Israel and Judah, but who is the greatest king of Israel? You could arguably say, even in that context, Josiah was the greatest of all the kings. And then even then, in verse 26, it says, nevertheless, the Lord did not turn away from the heat of his fierce anger, which burned against Judah because of all Manasseh had done to provoke him to anger. Yeah. I think in Judah, Manasseh was probably, he was Ahab. Yeah. And it would be a close race between him and Manasseh and what they did in Israel. And then after Josiah comes more to the end of his reign, he was killed by Necho, who was Pharaoh in Egypt, and then we move into the downfall or into the next coming time of Israel. Now, if you remember in chapter 24, Assyria takes Israel from Egypt, and they essentially go. Israel is in exile. The Babylon is now in Israel, and the only people who are really left during this period of time, when Babylon comes to take the people of Judah, they take all of the skilled, the leaders, the commanders, people of influence, and the only people who are left in Judah when Babylon comes in to take them into exile, the only people who are left are the peasants and the poor, and many of them rebels. We see this happen often where people from a country, when a commander would come in, they would take people from one place, plant them in another place, and then move the people. So you're just trying to figure out their surroundings. They're trying to survive, and whenever somebody's trying to survive, they're less likely to rebel. You also kind of take away their national identity when you put them in a land that isn't the land they were in. It'd be like if someone would come and take us and then put us in China, and they put China. You would have to adapt to your surroundings. You're just trying to survive, and it puts you off kilter enough that you're not rebelling against the kingdom that put you there. And it was kind of something that was left, but they left the peasants and the poor to work the vineyards that were there in Israel, and they even rebel. Even though all their leaders are taken, the people of skill are gone, they rebel, and then Babylon comes in and essentially just puts an end to it. Now, this is during the time when we see our prophet like Daniel is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're moved to Babylon, and we will find in Jeremiah during this period of time that a lot of prophets are saying they won't conquer you. They were telling the kings what they wanted to hear, and God speaks through Jeremiah and says, those people don't speak for me. You're going into captivity, and I want you to tell them to become at home in Babylon. They are to go to Babylon, and they are to settle in Babylon, because I am going to give rest to my land because of what's taken place in this land. So in chapter 25, when Hezekiah brought all those people in and showed them everything that was there, well, they're back. Mm-hmm. They come into the temple, and they take everything that Hezekiah had showed them, and they completely decimate the temple and destroy it. And we end the book of 2 Kings with Jerusalem falling and going into exile. And in verse 28, and I think this is interesting, you don't want to miss this, in verse 28, and we'll start in 27, maybe read the whole thing. It says, in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the year evil Murdoch became king of Babylon, he released Jehoiachin. Now this is evil Murdoch becomes king. He releases the king of Judah that was taken into captivity from prison on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. Isn't this interesting? The king of Judah, the lineage of Jesus, is given higher honor by this king in Babylon than any of the other kings that were conquered. So Jehoiachin put aside his prison clothes and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. The king of Judah puts aside his prison clothes and eats at the king's table. Day by day, the king gave Jehoiachin a regular allowance as long as he lived. That the king was honored during this period of time. Even as a bad king, they honored him. I thought it was interesting. And that's how it ended, was they honored the king and of Judah that was taken into captivity. And then we come to First Chronicles. So as we're looking at Second Kings and First Kings, when we went through the kings, so we go through, let's review a little bit. We go through First Samuel, which is all about Saul and David toward the end being anointed. And we go into Second Kings, or Samuel, and we see David. We go over David and all of the things with David. We go back to First Kings, or go to First Kings, and we talk about the beginning reigns of Israel and Judah and Rehoboam and Jeroboam and all of those things, all of those kings and the reign. And then we go to Second Kings, and we see the kings that lead to exile. So now Israel is in exile. What you're going to notice as we go through the next few books is a review. First and Second Chronicles review a lot of what was happening during First Kings and Second Kings. And then the prophets, you see the major prophets and the minor prophets, and you're going to hear from them, and a lot of that is going to be during the time period of First and Second Kings. So the Bible doesn't work in a linear path. You go through history, then it kind of jumps back and goes through it again. And we see that in Chronicles. Many people say, why does the Bible list names and the son of and the son of and the son of? Well, there's a reason. It brings credibility to the history of the Bible. It shows you how you get from this person to this person. How did I get to Adam to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, from Abraham to David, from David to Jesus?
It's important, to really follow the promise God made with Abraham.
Mm-hmm. And to know where they came from. Ancestry.com becomes it's for a lot of people when they retire, they go to Ancestry, and there's a reason they keep that. They want to kind of show the generations that led to you, that you have a past, you came from somewhere, you're tied to something. And we see that in Chronicles, and I admit it does get old after a while going through it. There's no question. There's some things where I'm like, I really don't care. But there were a couple of things that I discovered I guess I've forgotten. And so let's go through First Chronicles. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want to show you something in First Chronicles 1. Noah, and it starts from the flood. Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And you see the sons of Ham, and it's good to just go through it, because in Ham, that's where the Canaanites came from. Mm-hmm. And you see, okay, so it's through the lineage of that you see Sidon. Remember in the Bible that there was people from in Jesus's time, and notice they're the Hittites, right? The Hittites were the strong fighting force, and because we were in Turkey, that they talk about, that's where the Hittites really hit the national stage. Also, Uriah the Hittite was serving with David. So it's interesting here. is David did not just have people from the lineage of Abraham serving in his army. You have people from a total different line, from the line of Ham rather than the line of Shem, that are serving with each other. And then also, some would argue, when you look at this, you see some of these people have different trades. Like Japheth had different skills, and you see it in his the tribes that come from him, Ham, some, and so on. But Shem is the line in which Abraham comes from.
Yep.
And Shem, it goes Shem, Peleg, and then Abraham. And of course, there's a number of people I'm missing there.
I would love to hear you pronounce all of them.
Yeah, I'm not going to. It's no problem. I could if I wanted to.
These sound like insects. Arpakashadada. Don't even.
Terah. Anyway, the family of Abraham. Then once that's established, it goes the family of Abraham, and this is what I didn't notice. We know all about Hagar. We've seen Hagar and the descendants of Hagar, and we know Ishmael, the firstborn of Ishmael. Now remember, these are the descendants of Hagar. Abraham is the father. It says it should only be Ishmael, right?
What's the verse again? So I'm going to pull it up for him.
Chapter 1, verse 29.
29, yep.
Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael. So Ishmael has all of these descendants from Hagar that come from Abraham. And there are 12 sons to Ishmael, just as there are to Isaac. So there's this alternative tribe being formed as well. So you have two of them, or an alternative family that Abraham has. He has a Hagar family and he has a Sarah family. But you never really hear about Keturah. And the sons born to Keturah, in verse 32, Abraham's concubine, Zimran, Shakshan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. And then the sons of Shakshan, Sheba, and Dedan, the sons of Midian. And so what you're seeing is...
Midian.
Yeah, you're seeing you're seeing two. I don't know why I missed this, and I've seen it before. But Keturah also gave sons to Abraham, but we don't see those sons anywhere near in the narrative until right now. That's why this is important. And then, of course, Sarah has a son named Isaac.
Is this still Moses' father-in-law? Is he a Midianite?
Yeah, it could have been. That's an actual name. Midian is a name. So the Midianites were a tribe. That would have been, could have been from the tribe, sure.
Yeah, because he was a priest, wasn't he?
Yeah, Keturah. Yep.
Yeah.
Sure.
Interesting.
So when you think of that, the Midianites, and the sons of Midian, Ephah, Epher,
that's not a good
Hanok, Abidiah,
Epher, get over here.
And Elda. What a name, man! If you need a name for your children, just look at First Chronicles. You may find one you may like. And then it goes into the people.
Question.
Yeah.
Is this any significance is there any significance when it talks about the sons of Abraham? Because I've noticed this way back in Genesis, and that's why it stuck out to me. It talks about his sons, but then when it goes to Isaac, it says that he fathered Isaac. So it lists his sons and all his descendants, but then he fathered Isaac. Just like when Adam, there was Adam and his descendants were Cain and Abel. Cain obviously kills Abel, but then it said when he bore another son, which was Seth, it says Adam fathered him in his own image.
Yeah.
Is there any connection there?
I'm sure there is, that he fathered him.
If I'm looking too much into it.
Yeah, maybe, I haven't heard anything in regards to that. It's a great observation, though.
Okay. Anyways.
Yeah, it's a great thought. Maybe somebody can dig into that further and find out what it is. It says the descendants of Sarah, Abraham was the father of Isaac, and the son of Isaac was Esau and Israel. And then it gives Esau. Notice, as you look through the sons of Esau, A name that may stick out to you in that is, when you look at, is Amalek.
Yeah.
And the Amalekites came from Esau, and you know that was a group of people that became a thorn in Israel's side for many years. And then the people of Seir and Edom, which would have been the Edomites, were also part of that as well. And then you have the rulers of Edom, and it goes through all of those. Not going to spend a lot of time. In fact, we can go through these pretty quickly. I want to take you to the next one, which was found in 1 Chronicles chapter 4. It goes through the sons of the tribes as well. And Caleb, you see the clans of Caleb. It goes through a lot of them. Nothing stuck out to me when I was going through it. But one thing does, and it's because a book was written about it. If you haven't heard, it's the prayer of Jabez, and we find that in chapter 4, verse 9. And I'm going to just take a moment and go over that. It says, Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. Now, where does he come from? He's coming from the clan of Judah. And his mother had named him Jabez, saying, I gave birth to him in pain. And Jabez cried out to the God of Israel, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory, that your hand be with me and keep me from harm, so I will be free from pain. And God granted him his request. Essentially, Jabez is this word of pain, and Jabez says, I don't want to be what my name declares. I want to live under the blessing of God. In fact, there's a small book written by, I think Jacobson's his name, on the prayer Jabez, and many people pray this prayer almost every day. Oh, that you would bless me, enlarge my territory, let your hand be with me, keep me from harm, so I will be free from pain. And God granted his request. You have not because you ask not. Make your requests known to God. And I think that's an important thing we all need to think about. It's a great prayer. If you're listening and you're like, well, what should I pray? That's a great way to pray. Notice what he did there. I think you'll find a blessing in it. And that's Jabez's prayer.
Jabez.
Go to chapter 5, and I think this is different too, interesting as well. In verse 1, when you look at Reuben, he's the oldest. Now, we talked about this before. Why is it that Jesus, the blessing, never really came through the firstborn? You know, Esau was the firstborn, but the blessing came through Jacob. Abraham was not the firstborn. He had an older brother, but the blessing, because we know Lot was his nephew. His brother would have been older than him because Lot was more around his age. He wasn't the firstborn. The firstborn really, even though in pagan days, the firstborn would receive the blessing, that is not what happened in any of these first.
Can I bring up a crackhead comment?
Yeah.
Maybe that was not a PC to say, but I was thinking about this on the drive this morning in regards to all of this and the firstborn, when it came to my brain. I haven't done any digging into it. It was just a thought that came up in my brain. And you know how the blessing always goes to the not the firstborn.
Was supposed to go to the firstborn, but it didn't.
Yeah, it doesn't. Do you think that has anything to do with, because there's an order to the universe and structure and everything, how God designed it all. And Adam brought sin to the world. He's the first, and this is the hard thing. So this is not heretical what I'm saying or anything. I'm just
I think I know where you're going.
So Adam is the first. He's the first Adam. In Romans, it talks about how he is. There is a comparison between Jesus and Adam, and Jesus is
the second one.
By one man's disobedience brought sin into the world, and then by one act of righteousness, Jesus brought life to all men, that he is the original Adam. Adam didn't have parents. He came from God. Jesus came from God. Is there any reason where that's like a foreshadow from what happened in the very beginning, where not by human election, but by God's choice and decision?
I don't know if that's something I would go around. It can be confusing, but
just curiosity.
It is interesting, and it does connect to that. I mean, because when you look at, you see Esau was the firstborn, but Jacob got it. Abraham was not the firstborn, but he got it. Isaac wasn't the firstborn. He was the secondborn, and he received it. Christ really the first Adam, the firstborn Adam, didn't receive it, but the secondborn received it because Christ, who was the firstborn, gave us his blessing. That, I mean, you could see that Christ, the firstborn, says, it wasn't taken from him, but I'm going to bless you, the secondborn.
It's like God's choice, God's election rather than man's flesh and their decision.
Right. It could work. Well, look at this in chapter 5, verse 1. It says, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, he was the firstborn, but when he defiled his father's marriage bed, his rights as firstborn were given to the sons of Joseph, of his sons of Israel, which is interesting because Reuben was the oldest, and rather than giving it to the second oldest, it gave it to the youngest. So he could not be listed in the genealogical record in accordance with his birthright. Though Judah was the strongest of his brothers and a ruler came from him, the rights of the firstborn belonged to Joseph and the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel. So it's interesting because of Reuben's decision, just like of Esau's decision, I think, and Cain's decision. The blessing doesn't go from Cain; it was on Seth. You know, Cain, Seth, Abel is killed. Seth comes and takes on that. It's never the firstborn; it's always the second. And we see this again and again. And we see he lost his privilege of firstborn by his actions and decisions he made. And then in chapter 6, we see that the Levi, it talks about the tribe of Levi and all of the portion of the land that was given to Levi, to the tribe of Levi. Chapter 7 through 9 is more genealogy, talking about the people and what they're doing. And you can find things in there if you take time and dig through it.
It is kind of fun. I really want to get, after doing this, like, I'm not just saying this because we're the ones putting on Bible in a Year, but genuinely, like, I found this actually interesting. And I just read, again, Matthew yesterday, just listened to it, and I was getting goosebumps, them going down. I listened to Streetlights, and it has, like, music behind the narration. And I'm getting goosebumps going down the lineage all the way down to Jesus. But before, I definitely would have just skipped it. But I want to buy like one of those maps you see at the Creation Museum.
Right.
They're like 25 feet, and it's like human history and like I would love that.
You want to geek out on it.
Oh,
and I think a lot of people would. Most of you at this point are just going through it, looking for pages that don't have names on it as you're going through this, I would think. And then you come to chapter 10. And you got to understand, all of this genealogy is important.
Yeah.
It really does bring credibility to all of what is being talked about, that this isn't made up, that there are actual names and people and lineage to this, that it is a true story. It brings credibility to the strength of the truth of all of this nation and the people in this nation.
It's not just legend.
Right. And then in chapter 10, it reviews Saul's death. And it's interesting, of all the things it just goes over how Saul killed himself, how his whole family died. And then in verse 13 of chapter 10, it says, Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord, and he did not keep the word of the Lord, and even consulted a medium for guidance, and did not inquire the Lord. So the Lord put him to death, turned the kingdom over to David's son. When it's God's kingdom, and we want to be kings, and we don't go to him and ask. This is why hearing the voice of God is so important. We are serving as priests and princes and princesses of the kingdom of God on this earth. And we do need to hear the voice of God so that it goes well with us. And it's very important to hear that. Also, 1 Chronicles 11, there's something else that I thought was interesting because it talks about David becoming king, and it talks about David's mighty men. But go to verse 6 in chapter 11. It said, David had said, whoever leads the attack on the Jebusites, which was where the city of David was located. The Jebusites were in what was the city of David. And they would mock the Israelites. Remember David, they would mock David and just mock him. And David makes this statement in verse 6. He says, whoever will attacks the Jebusites will become commander in chief. And this is where Joab steps on the scene. And remember, he was never afraid of David. He always contradicts David. He does what David tells him not to do, and then David does nothing about it. But it's here, he was the one that went and attacked the Jebusites when they destroyed them. And then it says, David then took up residence in the fortress of the Jebusites, which was called the City of David. He built up the city around it from supporting terraces to supporting walls, while Joab restored the rest of the city. The two of them really built Jerusalem. And so David's got some loyalty to Joab because he doesn't do it on his own. David is king. He's been anointed king. But Joab has been a big part of building the city. And there is a whole lot of respect and honor for Joab because of what he's done. And David's at a point where I dare not cross Joab because he's got the loyalty of a lot of people. And so David walks this very tight line with Joab in order to keep peace, in order to keep control. And Joab, in the end, kind of gets a big head in the end, and David says to his son Solomon, you need to put an end to Joab. Isn't that convenient? David's leaving the world, now kill Joab. And Joab does not leave with honor. He's actually put to death by Solomon, David's son. And then it talks about the mighty men of David, and this is a group of men of 30 that are pretty incredible. And I think the most famous of all of them is Benaiah, because books have been written about him, but really all of them are incredible fighters. Benaiah, in verse 22, it says he defeated a lion, he defeated an Egyptian that was 7 feet tall, and he defeated Moab's best men. And it's important to understand, not all of these men, these mighty men, were Jewish or came from the line of Abraham. There were Hittites, there were people from pagan cultures. They all come to David to fight because they believe in David. So this wasn't, David's army wasn't just made up of people of Israel. It was made up of a lot of different people that were fighting for him and with him. And then when we read First Chronicles, it really kind of talks about that they came along at different periods of time. People would show up in the camp of David to the point where it was almost like every day people would start showing up. If you go to chapter 12, something I want to show you too in chapter 12, verse 8. Maybe you saw this. These Gadites, he talks about the different people who came to fight with him. He said the Gadites were army commanders. The least was a match for 100 and the greatest for 1,000. And it says that they were so good at fighting that they said that a set of them that they had the face of a lion and the feet of gazelles, that they could move as quick as gazelles. It's in verse 8. Some Gadites defected to David at his stronghold in the desert, and they were brave warriors ready to battle and able to handle the shield and spear. Their faces were that of faces of the lions, and they were swift as gazelles in the mountains. That would be an interesting sight. I mean, these are people who are scary if you're on the other side. Yeah. When you see that. So day after day, people went to David. David, over this period of time when Saul is chasing him, people are coming to David because they want to be with David. Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Then in 1 Chronicles 13, Saul, it's interesting, David wants to bring the ark to Israel. Saul didn't want to bring it. And why? Why wouldn't Saul want to bring the ark of the covenant back to Jerusalem? Well, I think one, Saul knew he had been rejected, that he was rejected by God. When you feel rejected or you feel guilt or shame, why would you want God's presence anywhere around you? I think when people feel like they've done wrong or they're not worthy, they don't want to be in the presence of God. Interesting thing, why do people stop going to church? I was just talking to someone about this, and this actually made me think of it. is people often go out of a sense of obligation, and they try to get that, like they try to find reasons why they would never go to church. Why was the church God's answer to so many things going on in our world around us? If that were the case, why do people not want to come? I really do believe that people try to avoid the presence of God. They don't want to be in the presence of God if they don't believe they're worthy, or they've been rejected, or they don't know if it's real. You really don't jump in. When you experience God's grace and you know you're worthy and you haven't been rejected, you really do want to be part of it. I was talking to someone, I said, if you don't enjoy going to church where you're at, you should find one you do enjoy going to, instead of trying to just skip out of it. Yeah. I think a lot of people just think, well, I just need to go, it's all bad. Yeah. Or either there's something in you that's not connecting to God that the enemy is using to keep you out of places of worship, or you're trying to stay in a place that isn't connecting to where the presence of God is not. Yeah. And you need to really find a place where you connect to God relationally. So Saul doesn't bring the Ark of the Covenant back. I don't know that he really wants the presence of God. Why would I need it there? He's not going to go to him. He's meeting with mediums and spiritists. So why would he need it? Well, David's like, we need to get the presence of God back here. And he tells them, we need to get him back here. And of course, Uzzah reaches out, he dies. David is then more aware. I think that experience causes David it was a check moment where David got very comfortable as king. And I think in that moment he realized, oh, no. God is on the throne. I'm king, but I'm not the king. God is the and careless. Yeah, and so he found a way to bring the Ark of the Covenant in, but he did it with respect and honor. Then you go to 16, and we're coming up here. I'm sorry, not 16, chapter 14, the last one. And as we come to chapter 14, and this is our reading for today, I'm reading that, and you know what stuck out to me there was the strength of the kings was often tied to the number of wives, and especially to the number of sons they had. So David had all of these wives. You ask, how could he have interacted with all of those wives? Is he involved physically with 700 wives or 500 wives, whatever it is? No, that is not what's going on. Many of these wives that David took as a wife was just taken as a kingly duty to create a relationship with the nations they were going into treaty with. So David was not so sexually addicted that he had to have that many wives. These wives were being married to bring the two nations into a marriage, essentially. And my guess is David, although was with multiple women, very possibly he had multiple wives. We know that he would have been like Abigail, and he took Michal back, and there's some other wives. It wouldn't have been to the extent that we think it was with all of the wives and concubines, but it made you a stronger king if you had all of those wives. And not all of those wives maybe gave him kings. Imagine Michal. Physically, just think about it. Physically. And this may be crude for some listeners, but physically for him to be able to do that while being king, when you go to battle, you're not there. Physically, how possible would it have been for David?
You have no free time
to do all of that. Yeah. I mean, think about it. To create the sons that he had, we know Bathsheba, and anyway, something to think about there. It was really about the strength.
Don't think about it too long.
Yeah. And in the first battle of David, that David goes into, and this is interesting, as the king of Israel, the first battle he goes into, God says, yeah, I'm going to help you defeat the Philistines, but I want to show you something first. And it's the story of the Spirit going through the balsam trees. He says, I'm going to go before you. He's wanting to show David you don't need to fight your battles. I'll fight them before you get there. I'll prepare the way for you to come and fight the battles. And it's an interesting thing that David experiences in this battle with, he says, go line up in front of the balsam tree. And when you hear the wind go through the tops of the balsam trees, know that's me going before you to prepare a way, then go in faith.
Cool. Yeah.
So God is establishing himself in David's reign as king over Israel. So we've come up on the end of what we had to read, and we want to encourage you to stick with this. Keep going, guys. We're going to get through this. It's exciting to get through what God has for us, and we'll find it reading the Word. We'll see you next week as we go through the Word in a year. God bless.